Okay, so what we shall do, colleagues, if it's all right, is that we'll listen to some minutes of Air Dr. Rieff and get at least a taste of him, but we won't go through the full 30 minutes because I think it might be a little tricky. So, as Warner Wolf would say, let's go to the videotape. You guys are too young for that.
So, the question, as I know, in the tradition out of which I come, God terms are those judgmental realities that we do not invent, but seek to discover through our acts of knowledge and of faith. These are modalities of discovery that possess us, but we do not possess them. A God term would be, in Plato, the ideas. It seems to me nonsensical in Plato to think that the God term is just a heuristic device generalizing all tables. Therefore, tableness, as one of my instructors taught me, is really the idea of table. That's a general abstraction, characterization of table. In sociology, this has been turned into ideals. Durkheim tells us that society is finally characterized by its ideals, and every society must have its ideal consciousness, therefore must be examined in certain particular enactments and institutional expressions and so forth. This begins to treat what the tradition I refuse to abandon, but know has been seriously abandoned by many of us, and in part by me. If you will, not only the post-religious, but in a very important sense, the post-rational period in the history of our own culture. I have no notion at all about Buddhist culture. I know nothing about them. I've read a lot of books, at least a certain number of books, but I haven't experienced those. I haven't thought those through. I haven't experienced them intellectually, aesthetically, morally. I've had a few touristic turns through them, so I'm talking entirely about or quite complex, modes of discourse, understanding. And to be brief, the God terms, I find, have a variety of expressions, logics, references, and have always been treated with remarkable indirection. The very image of how the ideas are to begin, or how one begins to apprehend the ideas, or the forms, if that's the more precise name, is one of indirection, is one of remarkable circuity. But they're not our inventions. They are not heuristic devices in the sense in which colleagues bandy them about quite seriously. They are there, dominant, superior, and privileged in their existence. And from a truth becomes the nearness, so to say, of our approach to them. however circuitously. Now, the thing in itself is a God term. Kantian God terms existed.
Can we roll tape for another few moments?
My God.
And we have a vast sets of God terms with remarkable power that have influenced our sciences, our literatures, our poetries, our ordinary discourse in ordinary language. It is not to be called humanistic, it is not to be called, the disciplines don't divide that way. Although I would be hard put to stipulate, since I'm not a historian of botany, whether there are God terms there. But there are God terms in materialistic theory, and so forth. At any rate, we have the presence of God terms can only...
Aaron, thank you so much for that little taste of God terms circa 1973, Drew University off of some exit in New Jersey. So thank you. I should say, on the intertubes, if you are interested, and I sent this to David some months ago, there is a remarkably clear, clean lecture that Philip Rieff gave at Cal, University of California, Berkeley. It says 1959, but I suspect it's a couple of years later, on so-called, as we said at the time, race relations, which is hugely interesting as well, if you want to look for that. And while we are on the subject of Riefinalia, Aaron was kind enough to share with me a short letter that Alastair MacIntyre, who turns 95 this January, still with us, the great moral philosopher, in responding to Daniel Frank, a co-editor with Aaron on the Charisma volume. I'm just going to read it. It's very brief, but I think you shall find it interesting. Thank you, this is Alastair MacIntyre, thank you for sending me the advanced galley of Charisma. It is, especially to addicted readers of Philip Rieff, extraordinarily interesting, but I suspect that to those who are not already such readers, it may prove baffling. Rieff's method of writing was to weave and reweave certain themes over and over again, introducing new changes and subtleties into the pattern, but sometimes in so doing, making it difficult to be quite sure what his overall intention was. I take it, although only on the basis of a first too-quick reading, that the key to charisma is the last two paragraphs of chapter 19, and that when one has reached those paragraphs, it's necessary to go back and reread the text that leads up to them with an eye to what is going to emerge in capsule form in those paragraphs. A second difficulty in reading Charisma is that it presupposes too much from Rieff's other writings, both his conception of the therapeutic and the theory of cultures advanced in My Life Among the Death works. Rieff's Weber is the contemporary of Rieff's Freud, and the reading public have largely forgotten Rieff's Freud, something that was, if Rieff's theory of cultures is true, almost inevitable. One symptom of victims of the therapeutic is their inability to respond to his diagnosis of their condition. A third difficulty is of another kind. You quote Rieff as saying, soon before he died, there is always a constituency. That is, I take it, of readers able to hear and to attend to what he had to say. And it was indeed an assumption of his earlier books that there was such a constituency, while at the same time they, like charisma, seemed to leave too little room for this possibility. One reason why Rieff was unable to confront this difficulty was that he never recognized that insofar as his own views give us grounds for despair, they are themselves a symptom of the cultural condition that he diagnosed. One way of characterizing my disagreement with Rieff is this: I do not think that the gift of grace can be taken away from us, although we can, and much of modernity does, reject that gift. Just as I do not believe that the powers of natural reason can be taken from us, although we can misuse and misunderstand them. Rieff enabled us to understand such rejections and misuses and misunderstandings a great deal better than we might otherwise have done, and by so doing, put us all in his debt. But he never understood adequately the sources of that resistance to the corruptions of modernity that he himself exemplified. Here's the last paragraph. If I live long enough, I would like one day to write about Rieff's work at some length. But for the reasons that I have given, I do not think that I am the right person to write a review of charisma. I do not know how, within the limits imposed by a review, I would be able to commend it to those who do not already know Rieff's work and who therefore most need to learn from it. With every good wish, Alistair McIntyre.
Beautiful.
So what's the last paragraph of chapter 19?
I turned to Aaron, you could take a look.
It's too long to read. I'll be glad to show you a
What's the
copy.
date?
Yeah, I'll give you my copy.
Eddie, what's the date of the letter?
The date is November 16, 2006, so just a few months after Philip Rieff's death. Okay. If you all agree, what we had said before the lunch break is that we would return to that pivotal and necessary theme of homosexuality that Alan would lead us in a discussion of, and then we would immediately thereafter turn to the contemporary condition and how Philip Rieff intellectually plays into that. So maybe, Alan, I could turn to you.
I'm really not certain how much I can clarify. When I was asked to do the second volume of Sacred Order, Social Order, a lot of the manuscripts had already been used in the first volume, so that left me with some fewer manuscripts than I had hoped. But as I read through them, there were considerable chunks on homosexuality, and which, as I understand it, James Davison Hunter, who did the first volume, wouldn't touch. He said, "We're not putting these in the first volume." But my feeling about it was that some of these writings should be published. I thought they should be out there, and so I made the decision that there would be a considerable, there would be a considerable amount of the book devoted to the topic. As to what I think Rieff believed, I don't know. I will go this far. I think, number one, that he had a personal aversion to homosexuality, but more importantly, I think he, from some of the work I've read, some of it unpublished, I think he was very interested in how homosexuality had been hemmed in by cultural constraints. And that's the short version of it, historically. And so I read an early review that he did of a work on Greek homosexuality, in which he talks a lot about cultural constraints. So once again, I'm not certain I can illuminate much, but and as I did in the introduction, I said, look, the reader's going to have to make his or her own decision on this. But I tend to think that he treated the subject in terms of a system of cultural constraints. And once you remove the cultural constraints, then that's where the objections came. So I'm not certain I'm very helpful on this topic.
That's all right. Thank you, Alan. Aaron, Bob, anything to add on this?
Sure. Well, I will just say that about a year before George Steiner and I decided to do a special issue of Salmagundi magazine on homosexuality, I contacted Philip because I had read his essay, The Impossible Culture, in Encounter magazine, which is a long and quite brilliant essay on Oscar Wilde. I told him about our project and asked him if he would be willing to further build up that essay of his, which he agreed to do. We had some correspondence about the plans for that issue of the magazine. He was very enthusiastic about the fact that we had someone flying to Paris to interview Michel Foucault for that volume. Nothing he said suggested an intellectual aversion to the project, which included the participation of 10 or 12 very prominent gay intellectuals and writers, some of them writing in the first person about their experience. So there was nothing about Philip's response to this project that would have suggested, again, that he was queasy about being associated with it or with those writers. Nor would I ever have expected that of him, but I thought I should at least sort of report that.
I didn't discuss homosexuality per se with Professor Rieff, but I can endorse what David said, that he was in many areas not grounded in the real world and said things to me that I thought, for a man of such enormous intellect, were shockingly ignorant and uninformed about HIV. So in a letter to me, he mentioned, which he always does, the chapter and verse in Leviticus, which is a commandment against homosexuality. That it comes in a very long list of interdictions and commandments of things that one should not do. Only one of them is about homosexuality. Modern culture and civilizations have ignored almost everything else in that list. We don't stone people to death for breaking the Sabbath anymore. So why that particular passage is the one that we should all be following, I don't agree with. And then he said that he seemed to feel that in some way AIDS was a punishment for a moral transgression. Well, millions of people in Africa have HIV, and it has nothing to do with homosexuality. And the virus is not transmitted only sexually in many parts of the world. So to link HIV with homosexuality shows a profound ignorance of simple medical epidemiology. So again, as David was saying, when it came to the third world, the real third world, when it came to knowing anything about the fundamental truth and facts about disease, he exhibited what I would thought was shocking ignorance.
So probably it was an 8 as a metaphor.
I don't think he meant it as a metaphor.
Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, well, I read Alan Wolfach's wonderful introduction to the Officer Class volume, and I read the volume, and therefore all of the various things that Rieff writes about homosexuality and sexuality. I wanted to sort of cite two things that I think maybe are worth talking about. One of them is he thinks it essential to differentiate between what he calls public advocacy and private deviance. So that his objection to homosexuality in one level was an objection to the various political and cultural movements that built up around the advocacy of homosexuality, rather than to the actual performance of homosexual acts. That distinction seems to me, at least it was important to him, because he cited it in the work. So that's one thing. He also says And Alan Woolfolk develops this in that really terrific introduction, that it's important to think of Rieff's attitudes towards homosexuality in a larger context of his understanding of sexuality generally. And in that sense, Rieff says that all sex is lowering, that's his word, is lowering unless hedged in by clear and deeply felt interdicts. And I think, that's something which is maybe uncomfortable to talk about, but it seems to me worth talking about. I mean, what would be the clear and deeply felt interdicts that would inform, right, our sense of whether a particular set of sexual acts were or were not morally, humanly acceptable? Obviously it's something that, Rieff put out there. He didn't develop his thoughts. He didn't elaborate his thoughts on that, and I don't know what they were. But I have that question. When I read those words, I think, what exactly is he speaking of? Is he speaking of ordinary kindness in relations between sexual partners? Is he thinking of a particular protocol that would govern sexual relations? I'm not sure. But anyway, that.
David?
Yeah, I mean, look, I feel quite uncomfortable in this situation, but he hated homosexuality for all kinds of biographical reasons to which Yvonne rather subtly alluded a couple of minutes ago. This is pathology. It may also have been sincere belief. But, I mean, come on. Everybody in this room knows what that story was. A gay wife, for fuck's sake. That's what happened. And he never got over it. And all this, parsing and, all this stuff, this is bullshit. I'm sorry, it's bullshit. This was the great wound of his life. My mother leaving him for a woman. Okay? And this is, you could gloss it over, you could try to fit it in with his work and all the rest of it, but you'd just be wasting your time, because that's not what it was about. The second quote you answered, Bob, is quite simple. Gay people should shut up and be quiet about what they're doing. It's not very mysterious, that second claim. And that was his view, and I can tell you, biographically, that all kinds of flaming queens of his acquaintance he referred to as, things like, what was the old thing? Confirmed bachelor. I remember once at dinner, and there was a guy, I can't remember his name, professor, colleague from Texas. And he was described, my father said, well, would you come to this dinner? And I said, oh, this guy, yes, he's so interesting. He's a confirmed bachelor. He was this raging queen, and I know this world. I've lived in this world, this isn't, tourism for me. I grew up in this. And, we both smoked in those days, Fellow and I. And he had joined a poet in African-American history and sociology at Penn. I can't remember the guy's name. And, we went out on the terrace, and I said, how are you enjoying Philadelphia? And he told me what life along the river was like, which is exactly what I thought he was going to tell me about. And why shouldn't he? It's not, I don't say this critically. So, the first element, without doing all the rest of the biographical stuff, is, my mother leaving him for a woman, not coming back to the marriage, having had this very busy, intricate, complicated love life in Paris, and then coming, was the wound. Now, having said all that, that doesn't mean his opinions were by definition invalid. I'm not doing this is not a kind of, I'm not presenting something as a pathology. He believed in, marriage quote you read. I mean, and his views, I think, were, whatever their origins, were, views one needs to take at face value. I'm not, I'm not interested in, just saying, oh, well, he was deluded because of the scar of my mother's departure. I mean, that was his view. He also grew up in, remember, a working class or even sub-working class Jewish world in Chicago in the 20s that was intensely puritanical. Whatever people did, on the side, whatever their various, things they didn't, this life, as we all know, in those places, in those days, was a lot raunchier than the public, than it was publicly presented. But he would have grown up with people where sex wasn't talked about, where homosexuality, and look, he's not alone in this. This is why earlier, I think, to some extent, reacting in agreement with Rod, I mentioned the Solzhenitsyn quote when he came out to the West. That was entirely my father's view. And you have to take that view in terms of biography, in terms of not pretending that he wasn't horrified, this idea that he was somehow, being, considering the matter intellectually and coming to certain moral conclusions, that's nonsense. But coming back to what I think Rod will say when he finally speaks his piece on all this matter, and certainly what I, and speaking for myself, I also think this is his view. It's the view of a person who, on sexual matters, is profoundly traditionalist. And that's a perfectly defensible position, whether you like it or not. It's not my position, but it doesn't matter. And that's what, so there are these two elements. One is this wound, which created all this anger and hurt. And the other thing was a truly traditionalist view of sex, which he probably grew up with and never left, never repudiated. Doesn't seem to me very complicated.
David, thank you for that. And I think we're going to leave it at that. And now turn to Rod. And I would ask Rod if it's possible, in addition to putting Philip Rieff in the contemporary context, I'm also interested in your views as to whether the so-called turn to the right, the sort of so-called ascent of populism and all of that, what a kind of Rieffian reading might be of all of that, and not to engage in any sort of solutionism, but is there a way to potentially remediate or attenuate the kind of extensively exaggerated cultural critiques that we find? Is there a way to have those cultural critiques do proper battle with some of Philip Rieff's ideas in a way maybe to indeed tamp them down or at bottom to understand them better? And so over to you, Rod.
Thanks, Lee. We may need to go back and have you elaborate more at the very end, but let me make some opening remarks and then we'll jump into it. Well, for you who don't know me, I'm the only non-academic here in the room, I believe. I'm a journalist. My last two books have gone... I'm sorry, but you've taught college.
I'm a medical doctor. Does that count as an academic?
Whatever. I'm a journalist. My last...
It's a profession, as the old joke goes.
Yes. Okay. My last two books, the first one, The Benedict Option, which came out in 2017, and the more recent one called Live Not by Lies, 2020, they've both been bestsellers and have driven a lot of conversation among Christians in the U.S. and also in Europe. Both of them are in 10 languages. and among conservatives. The recent one, Live Not by Lies, has become a surprise subject of discussion among the anti-woke left, Barry Weiss, Heather Heying, Brett Weinstein, and others, for reasons I'll get into in a second. Both of them depend heavily on Philip Rieff, who, if I have to pick one intellectual out of my own reading that has been most formative to my worldview and my work, it would be Philip Rieff. I, as a conservative Christian, look to Philip Rieff as the key to understanding what's happening in our culture today and the decline and fall of the West, which is my perennial theme. But it started out kind of prosaically. Around 2005 or so, I was on the editorial board of the Dallas Morning News, and I struggled to figure out why the arguments we would have on the editorial board almost never amounted to anything. We could never seem, or rarely seem, to reach clear conclusions through rational debate. And somebody put in my hand McIntyre's After Virtue, where he talked about emotivism as the cause there, because people are no longer really engage in reason, but rather what they consider to be reasoning are just usually articulations of their feelings. That was the first time I'd ever encountered that. It explained 90% of our debate, even among people on the editorial board who were supposed to be debating in a professional way. And then I found my way shortly after that to the triumph of the therapeutic. And that really opened the door for me to understanding so much. Because the thing I care about most intellectually and in my journalism is the intersection of religion and culture. And I think Rieff is arguably the most important prophet of the post-Christian, post-liberal order in the West. Well, why is that? First, I believe his theory of culture and anti-culture illuminates what Zygmunt Bauman called liquid modernity, which is the instability, the radical instability of contemporary culture and the radical atomization of contemporary society. It dovetails quite nicely with market capitalism as practiced in the United States. So this is not just a phenomenon of the left, as some of my colleagues on the right would say. Second, I believe that Rieff gives us an understanding of why we are now in a situation I've called soft totalitarianism. That is to say, you can't understand the collapse of classical liberal norms within normative institutions without reading Philip Rieff. I think what we call wokeness represents the political and cultural triumph of the therapeutic. We all have lots of examples about this, but a recent one that really stands out to me is, I think it was last week or so, the American Academy of Anthropology canceled a lecture that was to be given at their conference, talking about the gender binary and affirming the gender binary. The official statement they put out for why they canceled it was, well, this is not really scientific, which is bullshit. Second reason was, and it hurts our trans members. It hurts their feelings. I mean, it's just breathtaking to me that even scientists can't have a scientific discussion without it being shut down for essentially therapeutic reasons. Tyler and I were talking yesterday, I think it was, about Michael Sandel's lecture at the festival, and about how it seems so anachronistic for him to talk about how it's so important for us to come together and find ways to talk about civic issues and things like that. This was something that I think might have made sense in the 80s or the 90s, but certainly not in this era of radical atomization and polarization and identity politics. This is Philip Rieff's era. I think that Rieff cuts to the heart of the crisis we're facing today, which is that you cannot have a culture or a stable political order based on therapeutic individualism. If we are to stop the dissolution of our civilizational order, we have no choice but to confront the therapeutic, as Philip Rieff defines it. Now, why do I call this totalitarian? Well, René Girard mentioned, I think it was in the book he published in 2000, I Saw Satan Fall Like Lightning. he talked about what he saw as the rise of the cult of the victim. He said, it is beginning to turn into a means of totalitarian command. Well, this is what Girard saw in the year 2000, and I think we're certainly living there now. It's the idea that that free speech must be suppressed or strongly restricted based on the need to make victims or help victims feel safe. And by safe, they mean never face any anxiety at all by having their beliefs brought into question. I was in Budapest in 2019 doing some research for my book, Live Not by Lies, and I went there because the book itself is based on things I began hearing around 2015 from people in the US who had come to America to escape communism, Soviet bloc communism. Around 2015, they began saying that the things they were seeing rising in the United States reminded them in some important ways of what they had left behind. Well, I thought that was kind of crazy. I thought the first time I heard it, it was from the elderly mother of a prominent Catholic doctor in America. His mother had spent years in a Czechoslovak prison camp for being a Vatican spy, which is to say she refused to stop going to Mass, so they imprisoned her. But she's the one who put this thought in his ear. He called me, and then I began to talk to people who had come from communist countries to say, is this your experience too, or is this old lady kind of deluded? Every single one of them said, yes, it's happening. And whenever we talk to our American friends about it, they think we're crazy. Because you look around and you don't see gulags, you don't see secret police. How could this in any way be totalitarian? Well, it is totalitarian in the sense that Aldous Huxley saw in Brave New World. Our idea of totalitarianism is from George Orwell, from the Soviet experience, 1984. But we have managed to get ourselves into a situation in which people, the masses, are willing more and more to give up their liberties for the sake of alleviating suffering, a feeling of creating a frictionless society where nobody has to worry about anything, much less being anxious. If you'll recall, in 1984, O'Brien tortures Winston Smith to make him love Big Brother. But in Brave New World, John the Savage, comes before Mustafa Mond, the world controller for Europe, who doesn't have to torture him. He simply wants to know, why won't you join our society? You have everything you want. You're totally cared for. You have drugs to make you feel good. You have porn. You have sex. You have all you could want. You have, quote, Christianity without tears. John the Savage says, that's the problem with you people. You're too comfortable. And what he goes on to say, because he's been raised on the works of Shakespeare, is that to be human is to suffer and to grapple with limitations and suffering. And Mond says at the very end, you're welcome to it. That came up in Budapest in 2019 when I was on a tram going through the city with my translator between interviews with dissidents. And she was a Catholic woman in her mid-30s, pregnant, married with a small child already. She said, you know, Rod, I really struggle with even my Catholic friends here in the city. If I say to them, my husband and I have been fighting lately, we've been having a really rough go of it, or our little boy is not behaving well, he's causing us a lot of stress in our marriage, they cut me off and say, you've got to get a divorce, Anna, or put your son in daycare, go back to work. You've got to be happy. You deserve to be happy. She said, I keep telling them, wait, I am happy, but a happy life is not necessarily a life with no struggle, but they don't understand it. I looked at her and said, Anna, it sounds like you're fighting for your right to be unhappy. She said, that's it. Where did you get that? I pulled my phone out, went to chapter 17 of Brave New World, which is what Mustafa Mond says to the dissident, the one guy who won't surrender his humanity and his liberty to the system. I believe then that we are in a society where more and more people are surrendering our liberty and our humanity to be relieved of these anxieties. A few years back, a friend of mine who teaches literature at a university said he had to stop teaching Brave New World because his students did not perceive it as a dystopia. They thought this sounded great to them. There's a new book out called A Web of Our Own Making by a humanities professor named Anton Barba-Kay, B-A-R-B-A-K-A-Y. And he talks about, in the book, it's about what technology, in particular online technology and AI, is doing and pretends to do to our humanity. The final chapter is his take, Barbicay's take on the Grand Inquisitor. The Grand Inquisitor in Barbicay's version is a Silicon Valley tech executive who says to him in very crass language and pointed language, listen, professor, all of the stuff you've said about the threats to humanity, it's just bullshit. Nobody will listen to you because we in Silicon Valley give people what they want. We give them a sense of connection. We bring them anything they want to see or know or buy. We can bring it to them. We give them happiness, and they will never turn away from us for the sake of that happiness. When I read that, I realized that this is Philip Rieff again. But we are now in a period where technology and the greater merging of ourselves with technology and the world framed and constructed by the experience of online is setting the framework for human discourse and the way we understand what it means to be human. And ultimately, I believe that is therapeutic. The idea that I think it is not a coincidence that we've seen the rise of the whole gender identity struggle among young people with a generation that has been raised not only online, but also with smartphones, which debuted in 2007, because people began to think that what I desire is who I am. And if you deny that desire, if you tell them there should be interdicts, then they feel that they are being attacked personally. So to wind this up, Rieff gives us a key, I would say the most important key, to understanding why we in Western civilization are tearing ourselves apart. Yesterday here in Vienna, I met with a young immigrant from Egypt to the United States, a naturalized citizen, who told me that living in Washington, observing both the left and the right go at each other, he said, I don't understand why I've gotten to this country. I love this country, and yet you're all tearing yourself apart over identity politics, not just on the left, but also on the right. Well, Philip Rieff can explain that. Second, Rieff foresaw the rise of the totalitarian therapeutic and how difficult it would be to resist it because it makes us comfortable, or it's built on the idea that we should all be comfortable. And third and finally, Philip Rieff anticipated the decline and the dissolution of Christianity in the face of the sexual revolution, which he said, as you all know, was more important than the Bolshevik Revolution, which I think was probably a controversial thing to say in 1966. I believe, as a Christian, that we are living through, for Christians in the 21st century, what the 4th century was for the pagans of the Roman Empire. I'm fascinated by the role of the sexual revolution in this world historical process. In Triumph of the Therapeutic, you'll recall, Rieff observes that the refusal of sexual individualism was, quote, very near the center of the symbolic that has not held for Christianity. And Rieff criticized contemporary churchmen as apologists for, quote, participating in the dissolution of their cultural functions. He said very sharply that the old apologists, the fathers of the church, knew better than contemporary churchmen what this was all about. I don't think Rieff would have been surprised at all that it is precisely over questions of sex and sexuality that the Christian churches in the West are splitting and, in fact, falling apart. I'm going to conclude by saying that it's crystal clear that Christians like me, who seek to understand the dissolution of the faith, can do no better than to read and absorb the writing of this stern agnostic Jew. There's a great book by my friend Carl Trueman, who set out to write a book to help contemporary Christians understand Philip Rieff, and ended up writing something broader than that about the invention of the modern self and what that has to say about the Christian faith in history. I think it is also true, though, that liberals of both the left and the right have to do the same thing as we Christians and confront what Rieff has to say about the dissolution of our culture. We are all living through, I believe, the collapse of classical liberalism, but beyond that, of the whole civilizational order, built on Greek philosophy, Roman law, and Hebrew religion. And as I said, this is happening in an age dominated by technology that can be used and is being used to therapeutic modes of control. When you look at how speech, certain forms of speech, are disallowed on electronic platforms. We've seen what happened during COVID, where the U.S. government involved itself to an extraordinary degree with Twitter, Facebook, and others to keep any criticism of the vaccine regime from being heard. I think that whatever you feel about vaccines, that civil liberties intervention is extraordinary. Finally, Lenny asked me if my relocation last fall to Budapest had anything to do with my reading of Philip Rieff. It really doesn't. It's really more of a personal thing, a post-divorce thing. But what I do believe, as a man of the right, is that the Orban government is far more realistic about the current state of the West than many of those who criticize him. But my relocation was not ideological. Nevertheless, I can say that Viktor Orban, based on what I've heard him say, believes or is really concerned that the West is lost, and he's trying to build his own country as a little ark to preserve its own history, which includes the Christian religion. But he doesn't believe, Orban, that there is a political solution here, at least not an entirely political solution. He once said that as a politician, he can give people things. That is to say, material resources, protections in law for institutions to be able to flourish. But meaning has to come from meaning-giving institutions, like churches, like the synagogue, like universities, arts organizations, things like that. If they fail, politics will not be able to save anybody. That's what Viktor Orban thinks. Well, my book, The Benedict Option, is based on the famous final paragraph of McIntyre's After Virtue, in which he said that there was a time in history when men of virtue withdrew from a falling order to try to build a small local order within which the tradition of the virtues could live on in this time of darkness and collapse. And he, of course, meant the Benedictine monastic order. What I tried to do in the Benedict option is talk about what would happen to people of traditional faith and traditional moral beliefs in this falling society. How could we keep the faith alive? And I say in the book, I conclude that we have to try to find some lay version of what the Benedictines did when Rome, the Western Roman Empire, was collapsing. Well, I'm very glad that the Benedict option has been translated into Hungarian, because I'm such a pessimist that I think that this is really going to be ultimately our fate. The only thing that keeps me from going full Rieff is that I am a believing Christian. I have hope, a real sense of hope, that suffering is meaningful. I also believe that as someone from South Louisiana, that when the hurricane is coming, you batten down the hatches, then you get out the gumbo pot, you ice down the beer, and call your neighbors over and have a party. So I have this sense of an ironic cheerfulness about everything falling apart, which probably is one way that I'm very much not fully in despair. On the populism question, Lenny, that I believe that if you look at the rise in both the United States on the left of woke culture and on the right of populist culture, it's all identity politics at the end. And there seem to be no authorities with the ability to bind anybody and guide anybody. It's all about what you think, what you feel at the moment. Hannah Arendt said in Origins that she named the signs that a society is going totalitarian, could go totalitarian. The most important, of course, is mass atomization and people being alienated from each other. We've got that. Another is the collapse of the authority of the normative institutions, a desire to transgress for the sake of being transgressive. There were some others. You see those all across the U.S. on both left and right. And this is why I'm so concerned about who the authority is going to be. We will have another authority. It could be Napoleon. It could be, we hope that it's somebody benign, but I think history doesn't give us much reason to be confident that it will be.
Rod, thank you so much for that. I imagine there are going to be a lot of 10 cards going up. Can I just ask quickly, just a point of information? Does Prime Minister Viktor Orban have the collected works of Philip Rieff, as far as you know?
I doubt it, but maybe I could get him that for Christmas.
Okay. So let's begin, please. Aaron, Susan, Tyler.
So I think I agree with some of what your diagnosis is, and I'm a doctor, so when I have a diagnosis, I try to find a treatment. And I agree that there's been an erosion of moral faith in the country, and that there's an erosion of normative institutions. But the important question is, what do you put in their place? Now, for millions of Americans who call themselves national Christians, what they would like to put in their place is a renewal of a form of Christianity, and a political figure is Donald Trump, who they would like to become their leader. Now, as much as you may have accurately described Professor Rieff's beliefs up to the diagnosis, he would not endorse Donald Trump as a political figure, and nor would he endorse a renewal of Christianity as a solution to the therapeutic culture that we have.
Well, I don't endorse Donald Trump as a political leader either. And in fact, I think that the fact that so many Christians in the U.S. do, and there was even a poll last week, maybe Washington Post, saying that a majority of Republicans see Trump as being the man of most faith among Republican leaders. I think this is entirely about feeling, you know, and I've had arguments with people on the right about Donald Trump, and ultimately, if you bring facts and figures there, even coming from the right, and I was not a never-Trumper either, I have a complicated set of views, but it's 100% about feeling with them. And this, I think, is McIntyre and Rieff all over again. And as far as the Christian nationalists go, they're deluding themselves. They simply are. But I think they're nostalgists.
So in both Fellow Teachers and in Charisma, Rieff explicitly disavows a hope for a renewal of Christian faith in this era, and he argues in both books that anti-Semitism is a fundamental doctrinal element of Christianity in the past. How do you respond to that?
Well, I mean, I think no one can deny that anti-Semitism is a deeply shameful legacy of historical Christianity. That's absolutely true. Thank God most Christians seem to have gotten past that in the modern era, thank God. But
the number of anti-Semitic violent acts in the United States is higher this year than it's ever been in the past.
Ever in history?
Yes.
Well, I'm not one to deny that.
I mean, those are the FBI statistics for hate crimes.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'm certainly not going to deny that anti-Semitism is still real, and racism will always be with us, alas. But I would like to see a society become more Christian as a Christian. I don't think it's going to happen, and it certainly won't happen and should not happen by the state imposing it. I think Rieff himself said that once a society has failed to transmit its ideals to the next generation, it's over. And I think that is a truth that is not widely enough understood by enthusiasts, but Catholic or Protestant, for...
He says a culture is dying but can no longer transmit its ideals.
Right. And I think that's true. That is why
But he didn't propose a renewal of Christianity as a solution to the problem.
And I don't think that can happen. I mean, I don't propose that either, even though I might like to see it. I don't think it could happen. And certainly a secular Jew like Philip Rieff, he said himself, he's not a fan of Christian civilization. But I think that my prognosis for Christians is and also for Jews, and in fact some Muslims in the West have become readers of my work, is to build local community as a kind of ark to ride out what's coming, because I think that we are in the grips of world historical processes that nobody can control, and the best we can do is just ride it out.
Susan, please.
Where do I start? So as a rootless cosmopolitan Jewish intellectual, I didn't expect to agree with as much of your diagnosis as I do. Like Aaron, I found in the diagnosis quite a bit, that resonated with me. One sentence that you said, I wrote down immediately, you said that there's a view quite prevalent today, particularly among the young, what I desire is what I am. I assume your explanation for why that happened is that people fell away from the church. But, well, let me offer what my, every interesting phenomenon has more than one cause. But what strikes me as crucial is that after 1991 and the end of real existing socialism, there was no longer even the idea of a universalism except the universalism that we're all consumers. We all have consumerist desires. Okay, so you do see something in that.
Yeah, absolutely, you're right.
Okay, but there might be other explanations and indeed perhaps other solutions than going back to the church.
I think that one of the chief features of this soft totalitarianism is the way it has been co-opted and taken under its wing. Big business has done this.
Exactly.
I mean, Shoshana Zuboff's The Age of Surveillance Capitalism is a great book that everybody should read. And I think that probably more than the liberals on campuses or in the media or in Hollywood, I think that consumer capitalism, as it emerged in the post-war era, has as much or if not more to do with the turning people into saying that they're nothing more than their desires, that their desires.
They're consumerist desires. I mean, we have all kinds of desires.
Yeah. But
I desire to live in a just society.
Of course. But I think it was
It's a longing.
Responsibility is what it is.
Christian Smith is a sociologist of religion at Notre Dame, and he studies the religious attitudes of young Americans. He said in one of his books, came out I think 15 years ago, he said, if you look at the data, it says that young people in the U.S. think that they are nothing more than what they desire to buy and what they feel. That they think there's no higher thing to aspire to in life than having fun and having a good job. And that's it. And this is across denominations. This is among contemporary Christians, Jews, and even the children of Muslim immigrants.
Sure. I'm just trying to point out that it's a desire that gets fed by billions of dollars worth of advertising.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. And this is, Lenny and I were talking over the break. A few years ago, it was funny, some of us who are followers of Philip Rieff, or readers of Rieff, and Wendell Berry, and Stanley Hauerwas, were laughing about how, and Alistair McIntyre, how McIntyre, Hauerwas, and Berry were all troubled by younger right-wing people reading them and liking them and saying they're really onto something. And Wendell Berry's wife, Tanya, said to me, Wendell is grateful that you all are reading him, but he doesn't understand it at all. He's just an old New Deal Democrat. And I do wonder, Philip Rieff didn't live to participate in all this, but I wonder if Hauerwas and Berry and McIntyre just can't accept the fact, or have trouble accepting the fact, that there are people on the dissident right, not the far right, but people like Jeremy Beer, who admire them and think they have something to say to address the deficiencies in contemporary right-wing political and cultural thought.
Great. We have Tyler, Yvonne, Shale, and then David. So Tyler, please.
Yeah, I have two questions, and Susan picked up on my one. Lash, as you know, writes The Culture of Narcissism in '79. People pick up on the narcissism discourse, right? And sort of treat the problem as an individualist problem. And obviously he's drawing on Rieff in that discourse. And he writes in the 80s a book called The Minimal Self, in which he says, you know, people who are latching onto my narcissism complaint aren't getting the full picture, which is that I'm saying narcissism is produced by these particular kinds of markets and capitalist institutions and so on. That produces a kind of therapeutic society, which is what you're both talking about. So I guess a question I have for you, since you seem to also see the sort of wobbly legs of neoliberalism, why is the solution of the therapeutic not market reform and other ways of sort of targeting this sort of systemically produced consumer society that then yields all of these sort of therapeutic individuals? So I guess my question is, why do you not have, why is the sort of Benedict option the one that convinces you rather than other kinds of sort of economic reform? And then the sort of follow-up question I had to that was, you know, I really appreciate that you're thinking about the way both the right and left are therapeutic, and I think that's totally correct. What do you make of the fact that, and I don't read you in this light at all, but what do you make of the fact that some of the defenders of sort of traditional values, and I'm thinking of people like Jordan Peterson or a more noxious version like Andrew Tate, right? Their projects are totally therapeutic, right? So they are certainly the mouthpieces for traditional values, but Jordan Peterson is a self-help guy for lonely men who live in basements, you know? And so, and I actually think there's a lot reasonable that's going on with, like at the macro level, Jordan Peterson's really reasonable, like clean your room, shake hands, look people in the eye. I'm totally on board with all of that, right? But then when he starts talking about lobsters, that's where it goes off the rails. But at any rate, my question, I guess, is how do you think about, you know, I'm on the left and you're on the right, and I agreed with a lot of what you had to say, but from your point of view, as someone who's worried about the therapeutic, how do you think about making sure and also telling the difference between the defense of traditional values, right, of the sort you would champion, and the sort of aping of traditional values, but in a way that is sort of deeply individualistic and therapeutic, if that makes sense?
If we could take, Rod, if it's all right, a few more interventions and come back to you. Great, so maybe Ivan and then Sheila.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting. My first question is on this totalitarianism story, but it is not the story. Is there a difference between therapeutic and pedagogical? Because this is the story we can say about all the things that phenomenologically you're saying that make sense for me. But to be honest, neither the communists nor the fascists like the people in the way they are. They wanted to make them different. They have a different idea how the good people are going to be, but it was a pedagogical project. It was not about people feeling good, just the opposite. Suffering was important, and this is why it was easy, some of the traditional Russian literature, to be used and mobilized. The same goal that since 1937, Pushkin became member of Politburo. So I do believe this is very important, because if we're not going to make this difference, we're going to stay on phenomenological level, and there is a cultural difference. So I'm not interested. The second story is about feelings, and I don't have any sympathy for identity politics. I told you I'm Bulgarian. I don't understand what it means. The story is different. These same feelings that we're so much afraid, they have been very powerful in creating exactly the type of solidarities that you're talking about. Lynn Hunt has this book on the invention of the human rights. And she has a hypothesis which I found really intriguing, in which she's saying, listen, it was the sentimental novel of the 18th century, which was read both by the aristocrats and by the basically ordinary people, that allowed the universal level of empathy that made the French Revolution possible. So from this point of view, is it not interesting also to put feelings in a much more historical context? We can play differently in different stages. So it's not simply about feelings. Obviously then has a kind of a strongly liberating stories, not only on the level of the individual, but allowing the society to reinvent itself. And thirdly, as I hinted at the beginning, probably I know simply Girard better than Philippe Rieff, but there was one thing on Girard that in my view is important, and this is, he believes that there is nothing less authentic than desire. So this is basically Girard. Girard believes that we desire something because somebody else desires it.
There you go.
Yeah, no, but yeah, mimetic design. This is what he, because he has 2 or 3 ideas that he's repeating quite often. But I do believe this is very, very important, and this is about the problem of desire. And I'm going to end up on this. If you go back to our talk about homosexuality and reaction to homosexuality and so on, listen, Russian society is not sexually conservative, to put it mildly. And in basically the surrounding of power in Russia, there is a lot of homosexual individuals who basically are known to be homosexual, and this is not a problem for President Putin at all. In my view, what we're touching on is something different. The fear that normal lies can become a norm. So basically, you're allowing this, so this is the difference between the pride parades and the guilt parades.
Pride parades and the what parade?
Guilt
Pride
parades.
parades and the guilt parades. So in a certain way, you're including certain type of group and people and claims, but suddenly you start to fear, exactly because of this Girardian, are the others going to basically desire the same thing, that this is the new norm. And what about me? And I'm going to end on Hungary, and as probably know, I know Orban quite well. So the story is that you're saying that they're functioning as an island. There is part of it is the language and so on. But in a certain way, this is not a Benedictine option, but this is exactly the island option in which he's stopping immigration in space and trying to organize immigration in time. But you cannot simply go back. Either you should reinvent something, it could be even religion. You cannot simply go back where you're coming from. This is one of the most utopian type of stories. And this is why I'm interested. It can be sustained for a while. It can give you certain uniqueness, identity, and so on. It doesn't matter you like it or dislike. But try to replace the movement in space, which is becoming uncontrolled, which I totally agree, with this kind of idea that you're going to migrate in time and you're going to go back and Hungary is going to leave, I don't know, back like this. This is something that I found highly utopian, but to be honest, slightly fake. Because Viktor Orban is smarter than this. He knows that this cannot happen. So in a certain way, this is not a utopian thing that he believes that he can do. He's, as a politician, much smarter than this.
Yeah, I just want to come back to this question of desires and capitalism, and I, of course, agree with that. I've written quite a lot about it myself, about how well consumer capitalism and this kind of fragmentation of identities. Well, how they agree with each other. But one needs to be a little careful here, because somebody said earlier actually, people are not without faith. They're just full of all these things that might have been called pagan faiths at some point. It's not at all that people are simply these folks. I mean, when somebody says, yeah, I mean, sure, it's the links are by now should be clear that the idea of consumer capitalism. This is a point Eli Zaretsky's made very well about consumer capitalism is fundamentally about being frictionless, and the sort of woke society ideal is also be frictionless, and that's the problem. I've taken this argument further, which is that the problem with high culture is not principally that it's racist or this or that. It's that it's by definition full of friction, and that's not acceptable. So that in a sense, again, my view, what I wrote recently, in the end, woke is just going to make the world safe for kitsch. That's going to be the end result of all this, in my view. But actually, faith is alive and well. So it won't do to just talk about people being a sum of their, the things they want and the things they want to be or feel themselves to be. They also are. I'll tell you a story. I was in a cab, and I speak fairly convincing Spanish. There's a Dominican guy in New York, who had an evangelical radio station on, and it's not a woke story, but it's, I think, emblematic of the time. He then started to talk to me about UFOs, and I sort of thought, well, I said, how do you sort of reconcile this with your Christian faith? And he said, oh, there has to be something beyond God. And I think, what you now have is not just these boutique gender and sexual identities, however you want to use these words, but you also have all these designer gods. I believe that phrase is Syros, who sort of inhabit the lives of these people, young people particularly. So I think what has to, again, I completely agree with I agree with most of what your diagnosis is, but I think the spirituality question, that I don't know that my father would have been, alive to, shall we say. He tended to think in binaries, remember, and that's not what, that's to my, if I can best opinion, I think one of the principal limitations of his thought is, I don't think he would have predicted this, as it were, all these boutique deities, which is also part of it.
Your father did not think in non-binaries.
He thought in binaries,
Yeah.
in my view, and that's a problem.
Yeah. Rod, go ahead.
Well, I hope I can touch on all the different statements and questions. I'll start by saying that I think your dad must have been of the belief that, secularism, meaning the non-belief in God, that was the condition we were in. Now we're never going to abandon it. I think he probably would have been shocked by the rise of bespoke spirituality. There's a book that came out a couple of years ago called Strange Rites, R-I-T-E-S, by Tara Isabella Burton, who talks about this emerging in the millennial generation, but especially Generation Z. It's not that they don't believe in God, they believe in any number of gods, of small gods. So it seems to me that from a Christian point of view, this could be like a recreation or reemergence of the world into which Christianity first appeared. But we'll see. I think that, Tyler, you said, why not economic reform? Why the Benedict option? For me, you have to remember that the most important thing to conserve is the faith. Mm-hmm. And not just faith in general, but a particular faith. I'm not a Catholic. I'm an Eastern Orthodox Christian. But I believe that we should have economic reform to the extent that it makes it possible for families to flourish, for there to be more economic stability. I'm not a neoliberal. And I think that that's an important part of overall reform. But in the end, the thing that I care the most about is communities of faith surviving modernity. But it doesn't rule out economic reform or any other kind of political reform. I just don't have the hope that politics is going to preserve the things I care about most. You asked about healing, and I think it was you. And what is wrong with healing? Well, I think when you ask that question, I thought about something an Orthodox priest I used to have said. He said, everybody comes to the church seeking healing. But that can go one or two ways. Some people say they want healing, but what they really want is an analgesic, something to make the pain go away and not deal with the problem. There are other people who come, and I tell them, we can help work on this, we can heal you, but it's going to hurt first. You're going to have to turn away from whatever bad things you're doing that cause you so much trouble. He said, those are the ones who want authentic healing. Now, to be healed presumes an ideal of what is healthy. And Christians have a particular point of view about that. Jews might, depending on where you are politically, you may have a certain ideal. But all healing depends on a conception of the good. And I think this is what underlines so much of our fracture today, is that and this is straight McIntyre, we don't have a shared conception of the good anymore. I mean, maybe very broadly we do, but we don't in a way that we did in America, say, 50, 60 years ago. Whether that's good or bad, that's a separate question. But I think it just is a fact, a social fact. Yvonne, you said that, maybe you were the one who brought up the feelings. I'm sorry about my notes. I think feelings are important. Clearly they're important. We're not heads in a vat. This is one of the reasons why I was once a Catholic, but my Catholic faith collapsed, because it was almost entirely an intellectual project, and it didn't survive the abuse scandal. But I think we have to have a framework that can tell us which feelings are good, which ones are bad, and how we can change, how we can deal with our feelings to be constructive. To get personal for just a second, I'm going through a divorce now, and after 25 years of marriage. And if it weren't for the fact that I had learned after, of all things, 9/11, how destructive hatred can be, unbounded hatred, because it led me to support the war, because I was so angry at what had been done to the city. And I saw how that compromised my ability to judge. Of all things, it was that caused me, when my wife filed for divorce, to say, don't go there, refuse those feelings. My feelings of anger, I think, were valid, but I also knew from experience and from Christian teaching, don't allow them to dominate you. And that's what I mean by saying that feelings are important, but we have to be able to have some framework to bind them. Otherwise, if our passions get the best of us, we're lost. I think that we have to have an idea, just as healing depends on a conception of the good, so does the idea of how our feelings should be bound. I think about racial identity politics in the U.S. So as long as I've had a national voice, I've been writing about how the rise of racial identity politics on the left inevitably will call up the same on the right. I come from a small town in the deep South. I was born in '67. I didn't realize how bad things had been with the Klan and all that in my own town until I was well into adulthood, because nobody talked about it, neither white nor black. It terrifies me how close this is to the present day. And Christian faith, prevalent in the pre-civil rights era, did not stop the whites from doing what they did to the blacks. I think one of the greatest things that fear me is the tribe inflamed. Whether it's the Austrians and the Germans against the Jews and other minorities, or whites against blacks, whatever, Hutus against Tutsis. I think this is the thing we have to be most aware of and afraid of. And I believe that by leaning so hard into identity politics, coming from the left, we are inadvertently calling these demons forth on the right. And this is something that greatly concerns me, and I don't know what to do about it.
I mean, I do think, to bring it back to Rieff, both the left and the right are dominated by politics that would rightly be described as therapeutic, individualistic self-help that have turned away from institutional questions and institutional reform. I think the right, that's happened in certain kinds of ways. I think in the left, it's a form of leftism I, as somebody closer to the Marxist end of the spectrum, don't think is really left at all, but nonetheless, there's been a sort of pathological fixation on identity politics at the expense of sort of economic concerns, and particularly class. But I think, in terms of the danger, I think I agree with you that the left turn to identity politics in universities, and also the sort of race politics of the left have invited this response, which is something left people and left friends of mine don't like when you say, but I think it's fundamentally true. Chris Rufo has a line where he says, and I'm no fan of Chris Rufo, but he says, they wanted politics, I gave them politics, about the new college in Florida. And I think that's fundamentally correct. You and I were talking about this, but it seems totally insane that so many American academics believe that they could be so intensely ideological on one end of the political spectrum, particularly at public universities, and court no backlash, right? And so, and I don't condone the backlash. I think what's happened at the new college is profoundly problematic. but nonetheless, I don't think it's a surprising outcome, right? And so there are ways in which I think the left has courted a lot of the particular backlash and the institutional capture, and which is one of the ways, too, you can see the difference between this. I mean, there have been Marxist professors forever, right? There's way more Marxist professors in the 60s and 70s than there are today. I often say when I have friends who are on the right say things about cultural Marxists, I usually say, and the next time you find a Marxist, let me know, I'll buy him a beer. You know, so I think, you know, what was distinguishing that 60s, 70s moment of intense political radicalism in universities from today is I don't think faculty considered themselves to be activists, even as they were teaching Marx and, you know, highfalutin French theory and so on. And I think there's been a shift to what often gets called the scholar activism model, right, where the goal is to fundamentally use the university to transform society. And I think that's what's core to the backlash, and I think that's why we didn't see the backlash in the 60s, where leftism was an intellectual project, not an activistic project within the university, you know, at least at the level of what happened in the classroom. And so I do think there's dangerous things happening on the right. I think the federal judiciary stuff in the Supreme Court, there are certainly, I think we've seen the rise of activist judges, and I think that's a problem. It's not only on the right, but I think it's mainly on the right. And so I think, you know, I see it as a both-and question. I think the left has captured institutions in ways that have hollowed them out and courted backlash. I think the right has done the same. Now you have people on the left who want to blow up the Supreme Court, right? And I think that's in part because of judicial activism of certain kinds. And so I see it as happening in both spaces, and so I think we're more or less in agreement about that.
So if I can make a suggestion, Yvonne is a two-finger, then we have Jerry, Bob, and Alan, but I'm going to suggest after Yvonne's brief aperçu that we take a break, and then we come back for those additional comments. If we could sort of reintegrate Philip Rieff into this conversation, it would be fantastic to the extent possible. And I hope that Betsy Lash Quinn is listening, because I would like also after the break, if you're still somewhat vertical, to be able to talk to us a little bit about your father and his relationship to Philip Rieff. So Yvonne.
Thank you. First, when I was listening, I want to tell you in the right place. What you don't know about this institute is that in 1983, some of the money that helped Krzysztof Michalski to start the institute was, on one level, Soros gave him a grant, and on the other, John Paul II gained the royalties of one of his books. And you have Charles Taylor being a permanent fellow, who basically is always going to interrupt the lecture because he should go to the church. Till now, no, but this is not a joke. I mean, he's a very practicing. Why I'm saying this, it's a question to all of you who know basically Rieff. What worries me, and identity politics is not my politics, this is trauma as the only source of a real identity.
Right.
This is what I'm interested for those of you who basically wear his list.
Thank you. And that's another point I wanted to raise with David. So let's take a break, please, and then we'll come back with Jerry. Thank you, Rod.